2 decades, 20 solar returns, 7,300 days. Nice and round number. On September 11th, 2001, your humble narrator rose like any other day, except it was not like any other day. I rode the subway from my apartment in Brooklyn to Manhattan every day. I had a stand, but this one day I got a seat, and everybody, the train went outside, was looking out the window, and I wondered what it could be. I wasn't interested enough to leave my seat, but when I got out at Grand Central Station, I knew something was different. There was smoke in the air. People were panicked, and it was not a typical day in New York City. My friend Roger Mayer and my co-host, he was in New York City as well. My friend Pete Liska was overseas, and he was touched by 9/11. I don't think there's a man, woman, or child on planet Earth that was not touched by 9/11. Generation X and the millennials that followed us finally got their monoculture event similar to Pearl Harbor or the assassination of John F. Kennedy. More importantly than myself and my co-host, we have the privilege and honor to have Lauren K. Johnson with us today, who is not only a veteran of the Air Force and served overseas in Afghanistan in particular. She's also comes from a military family, and her mother served. So we are going to get to have the privilege to hear from a multi-generational military family that women served. So we're very pleased and excited to have that. Lauren is also a writer. She has written for some prestigious publications such as the Washington Post, Atlantic, and Glamour. So without further ado, I'm just going to quote an unlikely individual, Axl Rose. What's so civil about war? Anyway, let's ask that question. We'll look back and we'll look forward on today's $5 buzz. So, Lauren, thank you for being here today. I read one of your stories, and one of the letters that your mother wrote to you. Your mother served in the Persian Gulf military operation, Desert Storm or Desert Shield. I always get them confused, but the date was January 1991. In January 1991, I myself was a senior in high school. You were growing up. I was a freshman in high school. I apologize. And not that important, but you grew up in Seattle. Seattle, 1991. There was an explosive situation going on in terms of music and culture. Seattle was not a stranger to music. They had Jimi Hendrix, they had Heart, they even had Sir Mix-a-Lot. But at that point in time, there was Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden. I'm sure I'm missing some other individuals, but
Mudhoney.
Mudhoney, of course. Lauren, what do you remember? I think you were a little too young to catch that vibe or that wave, but do you remember, was there something different about growing up in that part of the world at that particular time?
Oh man, I love that Sir Mix-a-Lot got a shout out there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I was a little too young to appreciate that. And, you know, my perspective is limited to growing up here at this time. So I can't speak to if it's different than something else. I didn't really feel the impact of that movement until middle school era, where my peers were starting to really get into Nirvana. I saw the album cover t-shirts for Nevermind all around, and I just thought, that's a weird picture. I was a decidedly uncool kid, so I didn't get on that bandwagon until much later in life, kind of as I moved away. I graduated high school here in the Seattle area and then went to school in Los Angeles, home to Roger and Peter, and didn't come back to this area until post-military, post-grad school, living actually in all four corners of the country before coming back to the upper left one, and have definitely gained an appreciation for it, having lived elsewhere. And you still can't turn on the radio around here without hearing Nirvana or Pearl Jam or Soundgarden. So yeah, I appreciate it now, kind of in retrospect, and enjoy a lot of that era's music, but definitely missed the boat when it was first coming up.
Yeah, that's understandable. I guess it's hard to appreciate something as it happens. I think we could all relate to that. More importantly, and I forgot Duff McKagan, Guns N' Roses from Seattle. Love. Shout out to Duff. Anyway, let's move on from music. And more importantly, you grew up in a military family, but I could say for myself, I don't know too many families where a mother served and then a daughter served. Can you tell us what that dynamic was like? What was it like with your mother serving, and what kind of influenced you to follow that same trajectory?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, there are a great number of service members who are legacy service members.
Yeah.
So something like 80%. Don't quote me on that, but it's a very high number come from military families. But the dynamic of mother-daughter is certainly not as common. For me, my mom was a reservist, so we didn't have that kind of traditional military environment growing up on a base where everyone around us was military. I don't consider myself a military brat. I don't think I can claim that term because we didn't live on a base or even in a military town. And
didn't move around a lot.
Didn't move around, exactly. Yeah, being in the reserves, and that was my mother's deliberate decision to go to reserves after serving active duty for a few years because she wanted that stability. She wanted to have a family and have that stability for us as well. So really the military was kind of a, not an ever-present part of our lives for the most part. She would put on her green clothes and go camping 2 weeks a year, and we liked to pretend that we were camping too and cook hot dogs over the wood stove and talked about it kind of vaguely, but it was more like something kind of happening on the side as opposed to something that was ruling our lives. Like I think the feeling tends to be for a lot of military kids with that ever present. We see planes flying overhead and tanks driving by our house, and mom or dad is moving the family around every few years. I didn't have that, and I'm grateful for that stability. So really, when the military became at the forefront of our lives was with Desert Storm. My mom's hospital unit was activated in November, actually Thanksgiving weekend of 1990. She got the call that they were put on standby and kind of thought that nothing would happen. It was a 750 personnel unit. They always assumed they were too big and expensive to deploy. And their legacy orders from the Vietnam era were to go to Germany to backfill for active duty members who were deploying out of there into the Middle East. But obviously that didn't happen, and she ended up going to Saudi Arabia. So really the military swooped in very quickly and ultimately swooped out very quickly as well. She was gone for about 4 months total, which was also a blessing in hindsight. Didn't know it was going to be that way at the time. Her orders were actually for an undetermined length of up to 2 years. Mm-hmm. So she was staring down the barrel of what she thought may very well be a suicide mission, mm-hmm. with the prospect of nuclear powers becoming involved. And she thought, if she returned, she might be returning to kids who hardly remembered her, which is something as a mother now, I can't even fathom just having that thought in my mind. But as a kid, as a 7-year-old, I wasn't privy to that information. So I just knew my mom was leaving and that she was going to help people who needed help. And it was the Army's job, and she was part of that. And I was scared and kind of angry, but also really proud of my mom for doing something to help other people.
Right.
I think I only answered half your question, so feel free to re-ask the second part.
I believe the second part was really just, with that, how did you enter into the military? What was your inspiration? I mean, was it your mother? Was it something else? When and what year did you join?
I technically, I commissioned in 2006. So I became an officer in the Air Force in 2006, but I signed a military contract shortly after 9/11 to go to college on an ROTC scholarship. So 9/11 was part of the impetus for that, but there are a lot of connections between my mom's service and her role in my life and my admiration for her that's ultimately led me down that path. And this is something that I've explored a lot in my writing. That was a question that I got frequently when I first started writing and talking about this, and I didn't know how to answer it for a long time. And it's taken some real kind of excavating of my own motivations and trying to put myself back in my shoes as an 18-year-old in the wake of 9/11. And, actually speaking of music, I do have a musical connection to 1990, 91 that is decidedly less cool than the grunge movement. But I'm sure you all remember the song God Bless the USA by Lee Greenwood.
Yes.
That kind of became a Desert Storm anthem. And we heard that song a lot during Desert Storm. When my mom got back, she had a cassette tape with that song on it, and she would often speak in our classrooms and go to Veterans Day assemblies. And if we were in a small group setting, she would play that song and talk about how she and her fellow service members would listen to it in Saudi Arabia. And it reminded them that people were thinking of them at home and that, we were all in this together to some extent. And she usually cried when she was playing that song, and we all would cry too. And I remember driving home from school on September 11th, 2001. And, here in the Seattle area, we were detached in a lot of ways. Things happened much earlier in the morning. I woke up to the news on my alarm radio that was set, or on my alarm clock that was set to the radio, and they were talking about potential terrorist attack that had just happened, and listened to the news on the way to school. And then we were all glued to TVs at school, but it felt very far away and kind of surreal because we weren't directly impacted at the moment. But driving home after school that day, there were people lining the streets with American flags and with signs saying, honk if you love America, God bless the USA, all that, swell of patriotism that we felt on September 11th and September 12th. And I drove past an intersection, kind of the main intersection where this was all happening, and crested a hill. And then Lee Greenwood came on the radio, and I just burst into tears. It was a total unexpected swell of emotion, and I had to actually pull over my car because I thought it was going to crash. And I think something kind of awakened in me at that moment, this feeling that I had felt when my mom deployed and when she got back, and the community who had embraced us this whole time she was gone, it just embraced her as kind of this almost mythical, heroic figure, and had that very, unified patriotic feeling around that time. I felt that similar thing after 9/11. And I think there's something inherent in me and in a lot of people that drives us to that military decision. Maybe it's a nature, maybe it's a nurture, maybe a combination of the two. But 9/11 was kind of the trigger that awakened that for me. And from there, I took that aptitude test that a lot of seniors in high school take to see if you'll be a good fit for the military, and just applied to scholarships to see what would happen. And when I got an offer, there was the financial incentive behind that. I got a full ride offer to my dream school on the beach in Los Angeles, but there was also a lot percolating under the surface with me wanting to follow in my mom's footsteps. Both my grandfathers served as well, so definitely a family tradition and something that we talked about and had a lot of family pride in. So looking back, that definitely nudged me in that direction, and then the series of events kind of just set that path for me.
So you enter into the military at 18, you say, right after 9/11. You were 18 at the time?
Yes.
And it was the Air Force you joined, right? So, and that's what they got into. So tell me, just how soon did you get in before you were deployed?
So I did my 4 years of ROTC, and commissioned in June of 2006. And then I actually entered the Air Force as an officer in October of that year. It was a very strange time in the Air Force. They were actually cutting out a lot of personnel. Downsizing was the term they used. So that's why I had kind of a 3-month period before there was a spot available for me, essentially on active duty. And started at this small base on the Florida Panhandle called Hurlburt Field, which is a special base, small, but with a big mission, kind of the like tip of the spear, as you hear, the Air Force equivalents of the Green Berets or the Navy SEALs, people who do those things you can't talk about. And maybe for that reason, I'd never heard of the base, because they do a mission you don't talk about. So got there in October of 2006, and then ended up deploying in April of 2000 pre-deployment training, and then arrived in Afghanistan in June of 2009. So I had a couple years, several years if you count ROTC, and frankly, none of us in my family, certainly not myself, expected there to still be a war going on when I graduated. Yes. And as it turns out, there were 2. And then when I joined the Air Force, I figured I'm an Air Force officer. I'm an Air Force public affairs officer. Like, I'm not going to go to war. And it's not that I was opposed to it. It just seemed like such a vague notion, you know, like most things are when you're 18, or in my case, a couple years older than that. But, you know, putting on something as weighty as a military uniform, you don't feel that weight until you have a chance to digest it a little bit, or until it punches you in the face, as it did for me.
Well, then that leads us into the next question. What was that experience when you got over there? I mean, what was that punch in the face?
It was a long, protracted punch in the face. So I actually volunteered to deploy. And this was a time in the military where more or less everyone was deploying. It was essentially an inevitability. I knew I was going to go sometime, somewhere. And when an opportunity came along that I thought sounded rewarding, I took it and volunteered. And most public affairs officers were going to major bases in Iraq or Afghanistan. And from my perspective at that point, we're just kind of dust writing press releases. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do something more hands-on. I had also recently read the book 3 Cups of Tea, which was really popular in 2008, 2009, was kind of required reading for a lot of military personnel. And just really fell in love with the idea of working with locals and building capacity and, you know, that hearts and minds mission.
Yeah.
So I volunteered for a provincial reconstruction team, which was assigned to one of the Afghanistan provinces. I was in Paktia province, tiny little province in southeastern Afghanistan on the Pakistan border. And our mission was to build governance capacity by mentoring officials and undermining or eroding support for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and other factions while building support for the government. So trying to legitimize the government and help people get more access to security, rule of law, basic services. That sounds like a very lofty mission, and it was. And I definitely drank the Kool-Aid going in and thought, you know, I'm going to be like Greg Mortensen, who wrote 3 Cups of Tea. I'm going to be building schools and, you know, kissing babies and holding hands and singing Kumbaya and all that, you know, wonderful, warm, fuzzy stuff. And did do some of that, you know, did a lot of like sitting around drinking tea and talking to locals. Met some of the women of Afghanistan, which was an amazing experience and not something that a lot of people have the privilege of doing. And just, you know, talking through an interpreter, because I am terrible with languages and only picked up very basic Pashto phrases, and mostly they involve like, you know, put your hands up, stop. But just getting a chance to, you know, actually talk to the local people with no pretenses of politics or money exchanging hands. But by and large, it very quickly became apparent that we were not going to be changing the world in 9 months. And that realization hit me very hard. I fully admit I was quite naive and overly optimistic going in, and that clash of expectations and reality was a challenging one. Just realizing, the stories you hear about war from the media, from memoirs, from Hollywood, they communicate, not untruths necessarily, just far from the whole truth and the full picture.
Well,
And
especially if you're, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, being there on the ground, obviously my perspective was limited to a certain place and a certain time and a certain role, and definitely colored by the fact that I was wearing a military uniform and serving on military missions. But it was just so clear how incredibly complicated the situation was, and how much history and geography and political dynamics, tribal dynamics played into everything that happened. And, coming in and trying to put an American map of democracy over a foreign land is just not something that you can do, frankly. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the ideological wars of World War I and World War II were clearly defined. Those were simple terms in many ways. Once we hit Vietnam as a country, that's the beginning of us not understanding, a certain ideology that had nothing to do with even our enemies at the time, or why we were there. I mean, Vietnam was a shambolic, in my opinion, war that we were in. And I have to say that by the time we get to, fighting Muslims in Afghanistan and in Iraq, we didn't have a clear picture understanding of what that actually meant. I mean, it was an ideology that was completely foreign to us. And I'm not sure. I mean, I just watched the battery ram of all the documentaries that just came out recently, and Netflix and so forth, of the 9/11, and the one on Netflix particularly goes into a history. So I'm just saying, I'm agreeing with you on some level. I'm just wondering. That's what I'm saying. By the time we got to Afghanistan, I don't know if you agree or if you disagree. And you said that we were there and we found ourselves there until, last month, or the beginning of this month. What exactly it is was our mission at the end of the day, what we were trying to accomplish, and how quickly that fell, just like Saigon did in Vietnam. I mean, I'm just wondering, the way you were talking about how the depiction of war in the media and the sort of jingoism that military life comes with particularly the rah-rah pictures that we had in 1940s and the 1950s about our services in World War II and World War I, that parlayed into, another whole different way of depicting war once you get to Vietnam. And that, I think there's I don't know what I'm trying to say ultimately, than just other than that, when we entered that war, 9/11, all of us were hungry for something. We were all angry. I was there in New York. I remember that day. I am, as far left as Leo Trotsky, Laura, it's been me personally. But I will say I wanted blood that day. I was just as angry as anybody else. And that certainly stoked. I mean, I would have stoked anybody. So, I felt as American as anybody as any red-blooded Republican. I was completely equally, and we were all one for 1 minute. The one thing I could talk about on 9/11 is that was the one time I've ever seen in my entire life an entire city as big as New York where it became one person, one body, one being. If somebody fell down in the throngs of people that were walking north of Manhattan, somebody fell down, everybody was there to pick them up. If they were, people who the guys in the kiosks were handing out waters and hot, Grace Papaya was handing out free hot dogs. Everybody became one. That line to give blood, that which was never used once, all of it had to be destroyed because we didn't find anybody in the towers. That line was about 5 blocks long. It was ridiculous how many people were there. It was so yeah, I mean, entering particularly in that time, there was certainly a mission to accomplish, and one that I don't know how you feel, whether we got lost in the mission? You tell me.
Well, I don't think it was ever entirely clear what our mission was.
Right.
I mean, it was certainly a component of it was to get rid of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, and those terms are kind of used interchangeably in a lot of ways, and to, get out the terrorists who were harboring Osama bin Laden and connections to 9/11, and there's a lot of vagaries around that. And I think, there's some really great writing out there that, and books you can read about that initial, I don't want to call it a surge because it was very much not a surge, but the initial efforts in Afghanistan, where it was, special operations forces and a lot of, intelligence gathering folks who were really working very specifically to understand who our enemies were and how to get rid of them. And we're pretty successful in doing that very early on. And then the war just kept going. And the mission changed, and we got into this, nation building effort and winning hearts and minds. The provincial reconstruction team that I served on, that whole idea of PRTs actually came from Iraq. And the model was they thought, oh, this was successful in Iraq, let's use it in Afghanistan. And I found it ironic when I learned that, because the infrastructure in Iraq is very different from most parts of Afghanistan, and the geography in Afghanistan. You've got the urban centers that you have in Iraq don't exist for the most part in Afghanistan, except for like Kabul and a couple other very clustery areas. But by virtue of geography, there's all these little isolated villages. So taking this thing that worked in one area that's very different and trying to put it over another nation and say, this worked, so it'll work here too. Right. Even the idea of a provincial reconstruction team, like we weren't reconstructing anything, we were constructing from the ground up. This is a very long-winded, I think I'm losing my train of thought here, but just I guess that just goes to show that in a lot of ways, to me at least, it seems like we were making things up as we were going. And, in some ways that's inherent in war. You have to adapt and change as the situation on the ground changes. But I think we very quickly lost track of what we were trying to do, and understanding the local landscape and people and situation and the rich history of the area. And that disconnect really led us astray in a lot of ways. And we never really firmly found our footing in terms of a mission. And I can say, also from the military perspective, it was very clear, and almost like a caustic joke, that, we're not fighting, by the time I was there, a 10-year war in Afghanistan. We're fighting 10 one-year wars, because with the rotation of units, wow. Every time a new, group of leadership comes in, they have their own priorities that either they have an agenda for, or someone higher than them dictates an agenda for, and things just shift so rapidly. For example, my team inherited like $110 million worth of active construction projects in the province. And these were things that had been, to some extent, coordinated with the local government and their list of priorities in terms of getting, education services and healthcare services, those kinds of things. And very quickly that shifted when my unit arrived to stop spending. We need to account for this money and make sure that we're, being good stewards of taxpayer dollars, which is definitely something to be aware of. But it became just very, very clear to us that there had not been a lot of oversight in the past, and a lot of these active construction projects were not feasible. They were not going to be finished, or they were, built so poorly that you could pick them apart with a fingernail, or there was corruption at the site. Contractors were paying bribes to the Taliban to ensure security at the area, or a government official bribed a government official in this town, and the clinic that was supposed to be built there is going to be built in his town now. So just a very complicated web, and we really could only access the outer rungs.
Lauren, is it fair to say that you might have some mixed emotions then about our withdrawing, or do you see this as a good thing that we're out of there now? Because I can understand the investment, the emotional investment that you've just laid out so eloquently, having spent so much time there and written about it. I read your article that was published on September 11th of 2019, which seemed to suggest that it was time to get out of there, but not forget everything that had happened and what led us there. But where do you stand on that now?
Definitely mixed emotions. I do think it was past time to leave. I certainly don't agree with how all of that played out. And I think that those two things are not mutually exclusive. You can have regrets and feel mournful about things, but also acknowledge that it's time for them to be over. And I also fully acknowledge that I'm very privileged in my perspective in a lot of ways. I do have some friends who were killed in Afghanistan, but I was not touched as closely or as deeply as a lot of people were by that kind of sacrifice. So I can't even imagine the way a lot of people are feeling about this. I read a really wonderful account from an Afghan American who served in the military and likened our time there to a surgeon who treats someone with cancer, and that person goes into remission for 20 years. And then after 20 years, the cancer comes back. You can't blame the surgeon or say that, it was a bad thing or shouldn't have happened that the surgeon treated this person initially, because the cancer just ultimately came back. And I like to look for the pieces of hope. And, I think about some things that my team did. A lot of what we did, I feel like was, spinning our wheels or digging holes or deepening holes that had already been dug. But I do think that there were some initiatives that were worthwhile, like talking to those women. And we sponsored a training course for women where they learned about their constitution and their constitutional rights, and domestic violence situations, and some of this stuff that we take for granted here in the West. That there's been a lot of talk about impressing our enlightened values on Afghanistan, and how that's not a good thing regardless of the intentions behind it. And I agree in a lot of ways with that, but I also do think that there have been a lot of doors opened for a lot of people over 20 years. And I think we need to remember that. And I certainly hope that other veterans and those touched by war out there don't feel like it was all in vain. It's hard to hold on to that hope sometimes. And in a lot of ways, unfortunately, I think that we did just dig holes, but some lives were changed for the better. And I have to remind myself of that.
That's a great, it's a nice sentiment, honestly, and well put, for making sense of such a complicated situation. I think it serves everyone best to look at it positively, despite some of the mess that we all know seems to have gone on for the last 20 years there.
Lauren, when I read one of your pieces where you talked about the fact that you had the responsibility of bringing Beanie Babies to the villagers, I believe, in Afghanistan. And it was really intriguing when you went into depth about the Beanie Babies came from Indiana. They were sent most likely to the Eurozone, probably Germany or Spain, and then to, I believe, Kuwait, then into Afghanistan. to the particular province you were at, unloaded down a gravel path, and you had this responsibility. The one thing that you didn't mention, and I kind of thought more about, is that the Beanie Babies were actually made in China. The reason I bring that up is China creates this product that goes to the United States, comes around basically to the other side of the world again. What symbolism do you see in that? What do you think I know you were bringing joy not only to the villagers and the residents of Afghanistan, but it seemed like some of the hardened military men and women found some joy in something as simple as a Beanie Baby. But you were ultimately the person who was responsible for distributing this, and you were kind of almost like the gatekeeper of emotions. Did you have any, has that ever occurred to you, the symbolism or the momentum of that, something as simple as that? And also, does that just kind of let us know that no matter the difficulties or the horrors of war, every person kind of is on the same page emotionally to a certain extent, I guess. That's the right way to say it.
Yeah, I think you communicated that really well. And I had never thought about the fact that the Beanie Babies themselves originated in China.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are some well-traveled stuffed animals there. And so the kind of the full fruition is the Beanie Baby and back home with service members, or that they sent them in care packages back to their kids, like for a birthday or something. When I would open these boxes, they would say, "Oh, that panda is so cute. My daughter loves pandas. I want to send that home to her." So yeah, very well-traveled Beanie Babies. And I have not so much at the time, I think. There's a limit to what you can kind of philosophically ponder when you're in a war zone. If you do too much of that, you'll drive yourself crazy. Mm-hmm. But certainly after the fact and writing about it, I thought a lot about the symbolism and, what does this mean that we're receiving Beanie Babies? There was an organization at the time called Beanies for Baghdad that collected Beanie Babies, American surplus, and shipped them out to Iraq and Afghanistan for goodwill missions, humanitarian type things. And I kind of inherited it. I became the point of contact for my unit. And yeah, it's, I think it speaks a lot to our American perspective and thinking, these are cute toys that American kids like, therefore Afghan kids will like them too. And we had that experience a few times. I remember sitting in a meeting and watching a couple Afghan kids playing with their Beanie Babies very, very lovingly and gently. And it was one of those moments where, this transcends language barriers and cultural barriers. These are just kids having fun and playing with their toys. But by and large, I think when we distributed Beanie Babies, the kids were much more excited about the fact that they were coming from Americans, and this was some kind of American shit, for lack of a better term, than the fact that it was, an adorable little cow. They would get excited about, crayons and pens. So we would stuff our pockets with pens because the kids loved pens, and that, I'm sure you could infer things about that too. This is a communications tool and information, but they also got excited about, a single flip-flop sandal that ended up in a load of humanitarian stuff. So it was just, we were these aliens who were rumbling through their streets in these enormous, vehicles, like a Humvee on steroids, and we would charge into their villages in all of our gear and get out and just start handing things to them. I mean, I try to wrap my head around that perspective of a kid, these crazy foreigners who are just giving us stuff, and there's a toy in there, cool, all right, it's so I don't think it necessarily had that warm fuzzy intent that we were hoping it would. For me, the most powerful thing, as George, you may have seen in the article I wrote about it, what I had with my fellow service members, and kind of seeing a softer side of them. I would get these boxes addressed to me, And it became kind of a joke. Every mail call, this was like the most reliable thing, was Lieutenant Johnson is going to get a box or two from Indiana with all of these Beanie Babies. And I would bring the boxes into my office, and within a few weeks of starting this routine, I started to get a crowd around me every time I was opening a box. And people would just ooh and ah at the critters and see what there was. And someone started a collection of sea creatures. Someone else was collecting all the bears. I kept a couple cats next to a picture of my actual cats. And it just became something where, it was an opportunity for us to just, acknowledge that life existed outside of our little bubble in Afghanistan, and learn about each other. Oh, your daughter likes pandas. Tell me about your daughter. And especially with these, burly, army grunt soldiers, just kind of seeing that softer side was really impactful to me in a way that I hadn't expected.
It's like Frankenstein's monsters handing out flowers to all the kids,
Exactly. Yeah.
And Lauren, if I may, just one more question, I guess sort of related is, I know you mentioned media and Hollywood, depictions of the military. And I guess for folks, at least my age and probably older, it was always seen as the domain of a male. Or, when I think of movies like Full Metal Jacket or, Born on the 4th of July, Hamburger Hill, etc., it's usually a male. I don't ever remember seeing a woman in those films or in the show.
G.I. Jane.
G.I. Jane. Yep.
Right. Which I didn't give a fair shake to, maybe I should have. But I think it's fair, correct me if I'm wrong, when you were serving in the military, women were not, it wasn't a novelty anymore. Is it fair to say that when you were there, that women played a very important role, and that's still currently? Can you give us a little education and the listeners a little bit about that experience being a woman in the military for folks like, Gen X that isn't used to maybe hearing those stories?
Sure. Yeah. I will say by the time I was there, it wasn't a novelty, but still a vast minority. Mm-hmm. And the Air Force historically, and probably still does, have a higher percentage of women than other services. The Marine Corps, understandably, is the smallest. So I think the experience varies dramatically depending on your service and your job. Public affairs, where I was, tends to have more women. I don't know if it's the nature of the work that just draws more women. And my own experience, again, in a deployed environment is limited to this provincial reconstruction team. But I was one of 7 on a team of 80, so less than 10%. And tried not to think about it. My team was wonderful, and thankfully I didn't have to deal with a lot of the unique challenges that a lot of women do, the horrible things that women have to think about and fear. Thankfully, I didn't have to, I didn't encounter issues of assault. Any harassment was pretty low level, and I'm grateful for that. And I know that's not the case for a lot of women.
Yeah.
For me, my gender came into play most when I was interacting with the local population, because Afghanistan, and particularly areas like Paktia, are so conservative and gender segregated. It was a very interesting experience being a woman. I got, on one hand, the opportunity to talk to women, which the male soldiers, by and large, couldn't do. But I also was in kind of an awkward position when I was working with Afghan men, which were predominantly who we worked with. And this was, for most of them, not the first time they'd seen a female. We'd been there for 9-10 years at this point, but still I would meet our government colleagues, and kind of looked like the men with all my gear on and my hair back in a ponytail. So they wouldn't really acknowledge my womanness until they got close and it became obvious. So I would be standing in a receiving line, and a government official would be shaking hands and get to me and kind of go, "Whoa, you're a woman." And some of them would skip right over me. and shake hands to the person next to me. Some of them would look kind of like warily, like, okay, I think I need to acknowledge you because you're an American and you guys give us money, so I'll shake your hand. And then some were really, really excited to see me. We actually had issues with women getting photographed and like clips of women on the local news, even when they weren't involved in what was happening in a mission, because it became a fascination point for the locals to some extent. So for me, that's kind of where that came into play the most. And I will also add that, I deployed in 2009, and something like, 240,000 people had deployed at that time already, and they still did not have female specific body armor. So I was wearing body armor that for obvious reasons didn't fit me properly. 2012 was when they finally started piloting female body armor. So
that's changed finally? I mean, that seems just ridiculous.
A little
Wow.
Ridiculous, yeah.
That is.
I'm not sure. I would assume, I know they were piloting it at one point. I would assume they've adopted it. I hope they have. But yeah, the military is, it's like trying to turn the Titanic around in a lot of ways. My mom was pregnant when she was serving, and they didn't have maternity uniforms.
Oh, Lord.
And this was back in the early 80s. Like, and she was a military nurse, which is kind of the longest standing military role that women have been involved in. So yeah, just very. Sorry, go ahead.
My grandmother was a nurse in the Navy during the Korean War, but yeah, I mean, it speaks to what you were saying earlier too, how it felt like 10 one-year wars because there's such a turnover of leadership and interest priorities. How can you get anything done there when there's no through line of a directive, and then things like body armor for people get fallen by the wayside. I mean, it's unbelievable to me.
But yet we switched the types of uniforms we were wearing a couple times while I was in the service over the course of like 4.5 years.
You think that's because of like a new contract or something?
Yeah, it's like someone at the top decided we need a new uniform, and maybe there's legitimate reasons like this, gray. We always joked that the Air Force kind of grayish blue camo blended in nicely with a cubicle wall. That was about the only thing it camouflaged with. But maybe there were some legitimate reasons behind it, but it did seem a lot like, some general needed a bullet point for his end of tour report, so he had to initiate this change. And I think there just was, and I'm sure still is, so much disconnect between the people on the ground and the people, the higher ups making those decisions, that a lot gets lost in the interim.
Yeah, Adrian spoke to something along those lines where it took them years just to figure out a camouflage that actually matched the environment they were in. They were wearing these uniforms that they stuck out like sore thumbs, in the field, and it's just another symptom. Same exact thing you're talking about. I think they don't know, and there's so many different directives throughout all those years. How can you get anything positive done? Sorry, I just feel.
And it takes so long for those changes to get made in a legitimate, impactful way, and then actually filter down into practice. Sometimes by the time they get there, the situation has changed again. And another interesting example I can speak to is, I, as I mentioned, accepted an ROTC contract shortly after 9/11. So I started my ROTC courses and training in 2002. Fall of 2002. And for my 4 years in ROTC, we were very much stuck in a more peaceful era. Our training involved marching and, how do you square your corners and direct a group marching around, and how do you stand in formation when the flag is being raised? These are skills that I used never as an active duty officer. And we played volleyball and ultimate frisbee. There was not a lot of actual preparation for wartime service. We did do a field training exercise, which was a 4 weeks of more intense, kind of our condensed version of boot camp, which I fully admit is like Mickey Mouse camp compared to what a lot of people go through for their boot camp experience. But it took ROTC a very long time to adapt to the fact that we were a nation at war and to adequately prepare. And I can't speak to whether they fully got there, because my experience was way back before that change really took hold. But yeah, it's just interesting to think about reacting when you're such an enormous organization driven by so many economic and political factors. How do you initiate change in a meaningful way and quickly enough to actually be what it needs to be?
Lauren, I know that your time is limited. I know you have your family to get back to, but I really would like to ask you about your upcoming project, your book. Can you tell us where that stands in the process? Are you currently writing, or take us through that if you don't mind?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for asking. My book, my other baby that has been in the works for 10 plus years at this point, basically since I left the military and went to get my master's in creative writing. I entered my grad school program, a lot of vague thoughts and fragmented things that I felt I needed to express. And I left with a thesis that was starting to resemble something like a book. And have been working on that ever since, centered on my time in Afghanistan. But my mom became a big part of that story as well. And again, trying to understand how her experience influenced me and what it means to be a multi-generational military family, and a lot around communication, the stories that we tell each other and that we tell ourselves, and that we as a nation project that shape expectations like I had when I went to war, and that influenced me in volunteering for the military and then volunteering to deploy. So I'm very happy to announce that I have a publisher for my book now. A wonderful military veteran, Tracy Crow, has written or edited several books herself and has started a publication house dedicated to military stories. It's called Millspeak Books, and my book will be out with them in spring of 2023. So right now I am, I'll say in quotes, done writing. But as writers will tell you, they never feel done. And I'm sure there will be more revisions in the next year or so as we get that ready for publication. So yeah, looking forward to getting that out in the world.
Well, we look forward to that. We want to say thank you for your service and thank you for your time. Roger, and I really appreciate it. We'd love to have you back. I know there's a million, there's quite a few questions I would still like to ask you, but I know you've got your twins to get home to. So you're welcome back here anytime. Again, thank you for your service and your time. And I know this is a pretty significant day for everyone, a day of reflection. So we don't want to pull you away for too long. That being said, Roger, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
That was a fantastic episode, Lauren. I cannot appreciate enough you coming on and putting up with us and telling us your stories and giving us a perspective of, your time in the Afghan war and your service to our country. And I thank you for what you attempted to do to try to make lives a little better. I appreciate that very, very much. Thank you so much. This was a great episode, and it was spot on. But I'd love to have you back someday.
Well, I'd love to come back. Thank you for having me, and thanks for the great conversation. And yeah, wishing you both a peaceful day of remembrance.
I got to go do a schedule for a movie, so there's no peace for me. So with that, I say, thank you for listening to this episode of $5 Buzz. And remember to hit subscribe on our YouTube channel, as well as a like and or subscribe to our Spotify and or our Apple iTunes account. If you have any comments or questions, any potential guests or topics you'd like us to research or do, please get back to us at $5 Buzz, and that's FIVEDOLLARBUZZ at gmail.com. And we'll get back to you as soon as we can after our day of reflection here on 9/11. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.